Captain, we have them! We've established Transporter Lock, the Star Trek podcast. Join Ken and Sabriel each week as they explore strange new episodes, seek out new plots and new characters, and boldly go where no podcast has gone before.
Hello and welcome to the Transporter Lock podcast. I'm your Chief Engineer, Ken Gagne, joined, as always, by my commander,
Tiffany Bridge. How you doing, Ken?
Tiffany. I am doing fantastic. I'm so excited to have this regular cadence of recording podcasts with you. We don't have to wait for a new episode. We don't have to wait for next week. It's just all of Prodigy is right there, ready and waiting for us whenever we want it.
The only limit is our free time.
And our imaginations. It's true, though. A lot of people talk about their video game backlog or their book backlog. I'm sure you and I have both of those to varying degrees. But now we have a Prodigy backlog. I'm sure there are tons of people out there who are way ahead of us. In fact, a friend of mine sent me a Marco Polo video, and they mentioned something that I hadn't seen yet. And they said, "Oh, I'm sure you've seen this because you have a podcast." And I'm like, in this case, not a safe assumption.
You never assume I have made time for anything in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure if we were not podcasting about this, we might have binged it. We might have seen more than we have, but, we want to take time to really reflect on these episodes. An unexamined life is, I don't know how the quote goes, not worth living. So here we are examining the lives of the young crew of the USS Protostar aboard the Voyager, which is now a Heady-class starship, sometime in the future.
Exactly. An unexamined Star Trek is not worth watching, maybe, is the version that we should go with.
Yeah, I like that. Oh, and I misspoke. It's not a Heady-class starship. It's a Lamar-class starship.
It's a Lamar.
Named after
I was
Hedy
picking up
Lamar.
what you were putting down.
Well, I appreciate you not calling me out. I can make a fool of myself. Thank you.
Can't we all?
We can all make a fool of me? Thanks.
I mean of ourselves.
Well, whatever they have made fools of me, so thank you. Let's start with season 2, episode 5, Observer's Paradox. This is where they're now fully back on Voyager. They're being debriefed, and they're trying to figure out their next steps, our 5 young crewmen.
Yes. And, we are starting to get, I don't know if we're starting to get answers in this episode, or we're at least starting to make motions toward answers. We certainly think we're getting answers in this episode, which is nice now that we're, 25% of the way into the season.
Yeah. There was definitely information that moved the plot forward here, but at the same time, I kind of feel like this is a very small scale, but this was my least favorite episode so far because not a lot happened in a way compared to the action of stealing a starship, going into the future, disrupting the timeline, going back to the past, building a time ship, saving Gwen. And now they're literally sitting around eating burgers and fries. If you look at their plates, that's what they got, trying to figure out what to do next.
Yeah, but you know what? You can't sustain that energy level for 20 episodes of television, right? I think it's a truism of pretty much every form of media. And back when I was doing stand-up comedy, one of my comedy mentors really hammered this point home is, you can keep the audience's energy level high for a short duration show. So a 5 or 10 minute set. But if you are doing an hour-long special, you've got to bring people up, and then you've got to let them come back down before you bring them back up again. It's just too much. It gets to be too much. And I feel like that's the case in television as well. You can't maintain the same level of tension across every episode, especially not across 20 episodes. That's too stressful. Then what you have is The Bear. And even The Bear doesn't do it across every episode.
I don't get that reference. What is The Bear?
Oh, The Bear is an extremely popular streaming show about working in a struggling restaurant. That is a topic for an entirely other podcast. But when we finish recording, we're going to talk about it.
Oh, okay. And I suppose you're right. It's kind of like I used to do community theater, not stand-up comedy, but I'm sure some principles applied similarly. And they would say, like, if your character is angry, you can't start at 10 because then there's
Right.
nowhere else to go. And with some people who are not talented actors, that's their range. It's either 0 or 10, and they don't have that middle ground. But you need to have that middle ground because you need to show the character can respond and react to different scenarios to varying degrees, and they can get more angry if they need to. So similarly with this show, like you're saying, you can't always be action packed because eventually you run out of adrenaline and you crash.
Yeah. Well, I think it would be more noticeable if we were binging the show, right? Because they just got finished rescuing Chakotay, but in the wrong way. And then, as we see in episode 6, they then, jet off on another adventure. But so this is like the sort of connective tissue in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
And, we start off with the kids kind of having to fess up to Janeway what they did, which was so like beautifully uncomfortable. And watching each of them sort of face their debrief in their own special way, right? Like Dal's very confident, and Rock is just clearly like, she's clearly like the teacher's pet who is absolutely horrified that she's in any kind of trouble. And then, Murph is obviously trying to make his contribution. And, that was just like a really funny character moment, is watching each of them sort of squirm in front of Janeway.
I feel like the only person who didn't squirm is the person they gave the least screen time to in that segment, which was Gwyn. She was just like,
Sure.
I wouldn't be alive if it weren't for them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and Gwyn didn't do anything she wasn't supposed to do.
This is true. I hadn't thought of it that way.
like Gwyn didn't have anything to be in trouble about. Like, she was just in the middle of phasing out of existence, and they rescued her. So her interest is keeping them out of trouble, but she herself is not in any trouble.
That's true. I hadn't thought of it that way. I'm glad that they've reunited the gang. And this is something that I used to rail to Sabriel about, which was, for example, in the Next Generation movies. Okay, like, Worf went to Deep Space Nine, but you got to find a way to get him back on the Enterprise for each movie. And each movie just became more and more contrived about the Enterprise should have a new security officer by now. Why is that person getting shoved aside for this alumnus of the ship? And I didn't like that. But with Prodigy, when Gwyn left at the end of season 1, I was like, but she was so integral. And there are only like 5 or 6 people in this crew. The absence of one is really felt more so than with a bigger cast like TNG. And also I feel like a lot of these starships, the characters, they know each other so well. And with Prodigy, the characters were really just getting to know each other. Like, Gwyn and Dal were not friends at the beginning of season 1. And so to see that friendship evolve and then to pry them apart, I just felt like that was premature. So I actually do like, in this context, that they brought them back together in what I felt was a fairly organic fashion.
Yeah, and I think, as we got further into the episode, you really start to see the way Gwyn is in some ways sort of the emotional heart of the group, right? Because our friends here have been like, they've been on the same ship, but in a lot of ways they've been acting separately. Rock is very much trying to stay out of whatever trouble they're getting into. And, as we progress through the episode, it's not until that Gwyn really says, explains like, hey, come on, you're part of the crew and I need you, that she agrees to help.
Mm-hmm.
So, but of course that all happens after they spend quite a bit of time trying to figure out how to interpret what Murph is saying. I liked that they didn't like hide whatever's going on with Murph for too long, right? Because at the end of the last episode, it would have been really easy to wonder, like, what are the motivations of this character who we don't understand a word he says, right? Like, what do we know about Murph really? And so I enjoyed that they just sort of, like, rather than playing with that tension, they just sort of went right to like, no, let's just, Murph is trying to tell us something. Let's figure out what he's trying to tell us. He's seen this spiral too. What do we do about it?
So you're saying with some shows, especially a soap opera, they would not have pivoted so quickly to deciphering Murph. They would have let him keep his secret for a while before the rest of the crew figured it out. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that. And I'm somebody who grew up on Days of Our Lives, so
Sure.
I do not appreciate how little soap opera characters actually talk to each other.
Right. Right. And I think it's kind of, in some ways, kind of a lazy writer's trope. Like, it's a lazy way to build tension. Well, when you're, I mean, tension and drama is created by conflict, and conflict is not created by everybody being their best selves all the time. But how many shows have we all watched where it's like, oh, if you two would just literally sit down and have a 5-minute conversation, all of this would, suddenly there wouldn't be a movie anymore. Suddenly there wouldn't be a show anymore because you just haven't explained yourselves to each other. And so it was nice to not play like, is he or is he not on their side, or is he not going to tell them what's happening? So
yeah, I don't feel like that trope really shows up much in almost any of Star Trek. There are a couple of times when I feel like something wasn't spoken, not to each other, but to the audience. I was like, wait a minute, how did they get to that conclusion? Like, I found it confusing when Neelix and Kes broke up. I found it confusing when Spock and Chapel broke up. And I was like, how did they decide to do that? Did I miss something? But that's a different issue. I guess they were communicating with each other and just not with us.
I mean, well, I think for a lot of years, like, Gene Roddenberry was really adamant that the conflict in a Trek episode shouldn't be between the characters.
Correct.
And so there was less opportunity for people to rely on the, well, they're just not talking to each other kind of trope, because well, and then, on Discovery, like, everybody talks about their feelings all of the time. They do a lot of talking to each other on that show, which I personally really liked. Not everybody felt the same way.
I loved it. And you're right about Roddenberry. The first Star Trek to be made without his input at all was Deep Space Nine. And some people said that he would have been turning in his grave because all the characters there, they didn't really like each other. There was a lot of internal tension on Deep Space Nine, especially in the beginning years. But I liked it. And to your point, I think in some ways Discovery was sort of going back to the Star Trek roots. People talk about how different it is. They call it New Trek. And I was like, no, it's everybody talking about their feelings and getting along. I mean, look at the evolution of the relationship between Burnham and Saru.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's beautiful. And yeah, they didn't start off as friends, and Roddenberry might not have approved of that. But again, you can't start at 10 with anger. You can't start at 10 with relationships. And if you start at 0, it makes you appreciate the 10 all the more.
Yeah, I mean, Discovery in a lot of ways was like Ted Lasso in the stars, which I liked, just in the way that, the original series was Wagon Train to the Stars. It's I mean, every piece of art is in conversation with the culture that created it, right? So the goals and the conflicts and the mirroring that Discovery is going to do is just going to be different than what was necessary to do in the original series. And so too with this, right? We're going to have kids who are like messing up and not always making the best choices, but we're still going to show like a really tight group of friends, because we still want to show that the way that friends can have each other's back even when they're like hurt or upset or afraid, is something that we're going to want to show to children. And I appreciated that in this episode.
And we want to show it to adults too. I mean, that's kind of the whole thing about Ted Lasso.
Right. Exactly. Sometimes you just want to watch good people doing their best, right?
I feel like we are seeing a swell in positive media, and I would count among that Ted Lasso, She-Ra, Steven Universe, and probably others that I haven't discovered yet, but I'm really digging it. And I think it kind of started in a way with My Little Pony and Friendship is Magic. People quoted that in an almost mocking fashion, yet it really caught on with bronies, and people weren't expecting that this kid show would show up on the radar for adults, but it did. And they were like, well, you know what? If a kid's show is popular with adults, imagine how popular an adult show will be with adults.
Sure.
Yeah, and I'm here for it.
Yeah, no, we had a lot of years of anti-heroes. I'm really enjoying this this current wave we have of like friends being friends and people trying to better themselves with each other's help. And, like I'm sure it'll swing back around to anti-heroes eventually, but it's nice to be at this cultural moment.
Well, you can have it both ways. If you want to talk about anti-heroes being friends, I'm really looking forward to Deadpool and Wolverine.
Yeah. Yeah, sure.
Which could not be more different from Star Trek. So bringing it back to Prodigy, talking about communicating with Murph, there are two aspects of this episode I would like to chat with you about. One is the actual effort to chat with him. And secondly, that mysterious circle that he made that they're trying to decipher. Which of those do you want to talk about first?
Well, so he draws the spiral, and it's pretty clear right away that it's the same spiral that Gwen saw. And it seemed like it kind of flipped a switch with the kids because, like, first of all, they start hiding the spiral from when the adults come in, right? Which I thought was interesting that they didn't immediately say like, "Hey, look, here's what we found." Like they really hold that card close to the vest, which I thought was kind of interesting. But I mean, as the spiral motif, as they start digging into the spiral itself, it was interesting how they sort of convey the connection to Chakotay, which I realize we get a little later on, but when we see that sort of petroglyph that they find in the ship's database, and then we see that same petroglyph on Janeway's shelf in her ready room because it was a gift from Chakotay, who literally called it a beacon to guide me home.
Yeah, I feel like that whole thing was strange because, well, first of all, I didn't remember that Gwen had seen that same spiral. So I take it at their word that she did. I didn't go back and check. But also, if this is a map for how to find Chakotay, then it means that it's a map that he gave Janeway before he even got lost. So
Mhm.
is Chakotay hiding out somewhere where he knows he will be found because he already gave them the map? Like, did he choose that place because he knows there's a map to it? Or is there some temporal paradox here where he gave them a map because that's where he got lost? It's confusing.
Yeah, well, I feel like, and I couldn't tell if it was just like my perception or not, but the whole thing with the spiral, I couldn't tell. Like, here's the spiral. Chakotay's associated with this spiral. The spiral's associated with Chakotay's homeworld. Therefore, our mysterious benefactor is Chakotay, mysteriously fixing
Yeah.
the ship from afar. I felt like they really kind of jumped to that conclusion, and I felt like maybe there was a little bit of lamp shading going on. And so what I'm wondering is like, is this really Chakotay? Have we already figured that out in episode 5 of 20? Or is there like a misdirect happening here?
You know what? I found that leap so confounding that I actually kind of forgot that they had made it. But yeah, I was like, how did you get from A to B here? Because that was not a leap I would have made had I been in their shoes. I found that confusing.
Yeah. Well, and, like getting back to trying to decipher Murph, like Murph's message was find me. And then Gwen, changes the frequency modulator on her keep me from phasing out of existence armband. And, what she hears is find me before they do. And like everybody's assuming that it's Chakotay, and maybe it is Chakotay, but it just feels like, I don't know, it feels like a big leap for them to reach that conclusion without any of the other steps, without any of the other steps being explained.
Yeah, we don't even know what that means. Find me before they do. Who is they?
Yeah. Or is they like the crew of Voyager?
It could be.
Right? Like, if it is Chakotay, is he trying to set the timeline back by making sure that they get to him, but the kids get to him before Voyager does? Like, I don't know. We're not supposed to know yet, but these are all the questions that are occurring to me.
Or maybe he doesn't want to be found by Gwen's people because his protostar still has that construct on it.
Sure, sure. That's also possible as well. Find me before the Found a Cot do. Um, certainly possible. But I did want to I wanted to touch on something about the whole like translating Murph situation, aside from the fact that they made the whales plot relevant, which I loved. Um, this whole time I haven't been. Go ahead,
Did you catch the whale's name?
Jillian.
Do you know what that's a reference to?
I mean, I would have gone Gillian Anderson, but
Star Trek 4, the one with the whales. They go back in time and work with Dr. Gillian Taylor.
Dr. Gillian Taylor. How did I forget her name is Jillian? Of course, they named her Jillian. Of course, a whale would be named Jillian with that in whale history. Amazing. Um, the thing that I was struck me about this though is because I have wondered this whole time, like, what was the deal with Murph? Was it that is it like he's R2D2 and everybody just understands him even though they don't speak like him? Is he like R2D2? Is he like Chewie? Is he like Groot, where certain characters just understand what he's saying even though we do not understand what he's saying? But it turns out that like none of them speak Murph. And so Murph has been chilling with these people for a year and none of them understand a word he's saying. He seems to understand them. So are they R2D2 and he's the one who understands them even though he doesn't speak galactic standard? I don't know.
And can't he just write stuff down?
Yeah, I mean, well, he didn't even have hands until the end of last season.
True.
He was just sort of a slug.
There was an episode of Steven Universe where he wasn't able to speak and he was trying to communicate that he needed help. And so he's pantomiming and trying to use all these props and nobody understands him. So finally he just gets a stick and he writes in the sand, "Send help." And they're like, "Oh, okay. Why didn't you open with that?"
Yeah. Why didn't you lead with that?
Right. And
Yeah.
I kind of feel the same way with Murph. I'm like, there are other ways to communicate. If you think you need a universal translator, you're wrong.
Yeah, I don't I mean, I think like there was a lot of miming happening. I really liked the Jenkum tries to fix the translator and it doesn't work, and so suddenly he's shouting random words. Like that was so funny. I
As if
love it. I'm always here for a universal translator joke.
yeah, like this is something that Rock worked on for ages, and all of a sudden not Murph, Jankum is like, "Oh, we'll just do this," and we don't really understand why it didn't work. Like he put it on Murph, and Murph started talking, and it came out like really high pitched or something. Like what?
Well, and also
What?
it was just a string of random words, so it was clearly translating him incorrectly.
Oh, I feel like I should have turned on closed captions. I didn't understand that there actually were words coming out.
No, there were words. I mean, they were distinct English words. They were just unrelated to each other,
As happens, some people do speak like that.
as happens. But then we go find Rock, and Rock like the whole like shh, she's hypothesizing. Like I just
I actually had that in my
So-
notes. I had that exact quote in my notes.
yeah, I liked watching Rock have the breakthrough. Just Rock's my favorite. I feel her on a spiritual level. I enjoyed watching her just kind of like finally work it out while she's standing there in front of the whales, and then Julian is able to translate.
Yeah, apparently Murph adapts to his environment. So you put him in water and he turns into like a dolphin.
Like a sea creature of some kind.
I did find a little bit of amusement, and I'm sure this is only me, that at the beginning of the episode, when Rock is being grilled during her debrief, and she's like, can I have some water, please? I really need some water. And then she chugs it down. And then later in the episode, when she jumps in the pool with Murph, she says, "I know, Murph, I don't like water either." I'm like, I understand that these are different contexts. There's a difference between drinking water and drowning in it. I get that. But just to hear the same character make those two statements in one episode, I couldn't help but juxtapose them.
Well, I mean, also, like Rock, literally made of stone, so immediately sinks to the bottom. Like, how'd they get her out of there? She didn't swim back up.
They beam her
Like,
out.
yeah, I don't know.
That's a good question. We don't see that happen.
Yeah, and that's why I thought that's why I thought it was so brave of her to go in with him and very like self-sacrificing, because she doesn't float. Like, she immediately sinks to the bottom. And she's putting herself in everyone else's hands. And it's not that she doesn't trust them or shouldn't trust them, of course, but like that's a very like visceral fear, is sinking to the bottom of water and not being able to get out.
I think it might be somewhat ameliorated by the fact that she does have the proper equipment and she is in a safe environment. So I wrote a blog post this spring about how I just took 6 weeks of swim lessons this year because I was not a good swimmer. And yet I've been scuba diving at the Great Barrier Reef. Like I'd never been scuba diving before, but I strapped on that tank and I went deep underwater. And I wasn't scared because I have all the gear. I have a guide here to help me. She knows that if I do something wrong, what to do and how to fix it. So, kind of like how I sometimes have a fear of heights, but I go bungee jumping because I got that bungee cord wrapped around my legs and I know it's not going to break. And as long as I'm strapped in, nothing can happen to me. No harm will befall me. So it's very contextual.
Your lizard brain is much calmer than mine then. Because I wouldn't like I can't even look out of windows of tall buildings. Like, I have to stand away from the windows.
See, that doesn't bother me, but being near a precipice, like at a national park, that bothers me. And I think that might tie into intrusive thoughts, which is not a term I heard until I was an adult, or what the French might call the call of the void. That is something that manifests itself in precipices, not in tall buildings or bungee jumping.
I think it would manifest for me in bungee jumping.
It certainly
But
could. Yeah.
I'm happy for you that it doesn't.
Me too. So I want to go back to what happens after Murph is translated, which is Gwyn has these, I don't know, temporal coordinates or something, and she punches them in and she disappears into like 2001: A Space Odyssey. Was she actually somewhere else? Was she actually in outer space? What happened there? Where was she?
Yeah, I mean, I asked that too, because it seemed like she's floating in what appears to be the void of space, but she can't physically be there, right? She doesn't have anything to help her breathe or to protect her from the elements, or the lack of elements, really, as the case may be. So it seems to be like a vision. And so I guess is she in some sort of like Schrodinger's box quantum state where she does, and is that why the episode is called Observer's Paradox, right? Because like suddenly she's the cat in the box that no one can observe.
It's possible. She didn't, it definitely seemed to me that she was not actually in outer space for all the reasons you mentioned. Like, we saw her breathing, she heard a voice, there's no sound in outer space. But also, she started off in one part of space, went through some sort of a wormhole, and then was in another part of space. I don't understand the point of that other than just a cool visual effect.
Yeah, I think it was some sort of like middle, like liminal quantum state. I think that's why she wasn't supposed to fiddle with the thing, right? That's why she got the fiddling speech. Um, so that she wouldn't do that, because that was a risk.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of that quantum fiddling thing, this is the episode where they close the wormhole.
Yes.
And Janeway said, we have a young woman on board who might be affected by this. And they said, we don't care. Go ahead and close it. So Janeway did close it. And we saw no impact to Gwyn. Like, she wasn't aware that it had closed. We don't know if she even found out that it closed. If she did find out, she didn't care. And so I felt like that was a build-up to something that didn't happen.
Well, or do we know that it didn't affect her? Or will those effects be something that we see later?
Maybe, but it certainly wasn't.
Right? Is it a cascading effect? But I agree with you. Like, they didn't show any immediate impacts to her. So that was a weird little sort of loose thread that didn't get tied up.
As Sabriel knows, I hate loose threads, which is one reason why I like the Discovery series finale. They finally tied in. Okay. There are two minor references in this episode. Actually, three. We already talked about one of them, Dr. Gillian Taylor, but there are two other references to other Star Treks. And that's the only other thing I have to say about this episode, is just these two minor notes. Or were there any major plot points that we haven't talked about yet?
No, I don't think so. The only thing that I had left was to point out that the doctor does indeed get put in charge of mentoring the kids, as you predicted way back when we recorded our first episode.
That's right. It was hologram Janeway. Now it's hologram Doctor.
Now it's hologram Doctor.
I'm glad one of us is paying attention to what I said. So the other references, one of them was obvious. Well, perhaps both were, but Janeway was having an on-screen discussion with Admiral Jellico.
And he's the one who shuts the mission down because it's always Jellico.
As you have said, it's always Jellico, but we actually got to hear Ronnie Cox playing Jellico as opposed to just being referenced as in previous episodes. And then I think it was the doctor, when they were finished with the debriefing of the Protostar crew, said, "I have not seen a crew that dysfunctional since the Cerritos."
Cerritos.
And I think this is only the second Star Trek series after Strange New Worlds to acknowledge the existence of the Cerritos. And I love seeing that animated series be made more canon, assuming that canon can be quantified.
Sure. Yeah, I think I guess, we could sort of tell ourselves that the Cerritos is a lower profile ship. And so it's not necessarily going to be getting referenced all the time like Voyager and Enterprise would. But yeah, I agree with you. I like seeing these sort of more distant parts of the canon assert themselves as canon.
However, I do have to wonder if the Doctor only knows the Cerritos by reputation, or if he's foreshadowing that he appears in that show in the 5th and final season.
I mean, I assumed that was the case.
Oh.
I assumed that we just haven't seen the Doctor on lower decks yet.
Yet. Keyword.
Yet. Or else, maybe everyone has heard of the Cerritos and how dysfunctional they are.
That is true. Maybe that is their reputation. Enterprise saves the universe multiple times over. Cerritos is highly dysfunctional.
They can't all be the flagship, Ken.
Story of my life. All right, then shall we move on to the 6th episode, Imposter Syndrome?
Indeed. And this one opens with... Okay, I was trying to figure out what's happening in the opening scene immediately. I was like, are we getting like is Dal having a dream? Or are we getting a glimpse into his like deepest anxieties that his friends secretly hate him? And then like, it turns out, no, they're doing the 24 hours ago construction. And so we spend the entire episode like waiting for that moment when Dal gets attacked by a bunch of his friends.
Yeah, what did you think of this in media res opening?
I mean, it's one of those things that like once you see how common it is, you start to be like, oh, okay, here we go. But at the same time, it is an effective way to sort of like drop somebody right in the action, because the plot of this episode is in many ways kind of a slow burn if you don't have that, right? Because they're like trying to figure out how they're going to steal the ship. They're trying to figure out how they're going to steal the ship. And then all of a sudden, they come up with this idea about holo doubles. And then when they say holo doubles, all of a sudden you're like, oh, I get it now. That's how everything goes wrong.
Yeah, the in media res opening might have landed better for me had it not just been done earlier this year in Discovery Season 5, Episode 1. They did the same thing where
specific.
Michael Burnham is on the hull of a ship that's in warp. And then it says like 12 hours earlier, and she's just at a party talking to people. And then she gets summoned to the Infinity Room, and she's given a red directive. And then we see her on the hull of the ship. And I was like, okay, we just did that. It's
yeah, not... I mean, it's a well-worn technique at this point. I feel like it kind of got fashionable about 10 years ago. Though I feel like it's better than going for the laugh where they did like the record scratch moment and Dal says, yep, that's me. You're probably wondering how I got into this situation.
Oh my gosh. That would have been both hilarious and awful. That would have been some sort of meta something or other.
So, it could be worse.
Yeah. So they set up all these fake holograms, and holograms have come a long way since Dr. Leah Brahms, where they actually are quite accurate now to the original source material. I don't know where these psychological profiles came from, but
Not as creepy as Geordi setting up Dr. Leah Brahms.
Geordi was at times problematic, yes.
Yeah, I mean, we the list of problematic things from that era of Trek, like we could be here a while.
And also definitely not going to see that in a kid's show.
No. But it was it was funny because the scene where they come up with this idea of holo copies, they skip right past the shouldn't we ask Janeway if we can borrow the Infinity? And Dal goes straight to it's easier to get forgiveness than permission. I was like, okay, first of all, that's an important lesson to learn in life. But also you're really not giving Janeway enough credit for how much she loves a crazy plan.
That's true. Although when you say it's an important lesson in life, are you being sarcastic? Because is that something we want to be teaching our kids?
Well, I think, it's not necessarily something I want to teach like a small child, but I think as we move into like teenage years, like they're going to figure it out anyway. So it's important to I think this kind of gets back to what we were talking about last time about learning about like which rules can be broken and which ones like you can break them, but they're going to have consequences and you have to decide whether or not you can live with those consequences. And then like which rules have to be followed. Because right. And even with this group, we've got the range of it, right? Like Rock is following all the rules all the time. Jankum is trying to follow the rules and finding that it's not really working for him. Dal resents the existence of the rules to begin with and thinks that they are not meant. They're just sort of they're just restraining his existing brilliance. And I think like everybody has to, that's part of adulthood, right? Everybody has to figure out their own relationship to rules.
That's true. Now, for example, you could say that Rock is very lawful good.
Sure.
And if you read Memory Alpha, I think at the beginning of season 1, she was only 8 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Which, assuming that her species ages proportionally to humans, you really shouldn't be letting 9-year-olds into Starfleet. Like that's you should be taking better care of children, not letting them do these things.
Yeah. Well, she did have that, there was that one episode in the middle of the season where she passed like years and years on her own because of there was that time compression
I forgot
episode.
about that. That's how she got so smart and learned so many things. I totally forgot that happened. So she is probably
exactly.
much older by now. Thank you for that important reminder. I should probably go back and rewatch that episode.
That was the episode that I was like, okay, this is really a Trek show, right? Because that plot would have been at home on any of the other shows.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so yeah, I think teenage years are when children are trying to figure out their own relationship to the rules, and I think we do them a disservice by insisting that all rules must be followed all the time. I think we have to teach them to start making those distinctions. Follow all the rules all the time is for smaller children.
Right. Who don't understand the context and the purpose of the rules.
Sure. Mm-hmm. But also I feel like saying out loud, well, it's easier to get forgiveness than permission was like, oh man, this is not going to go well.
Well, I wonder if they didn't perhaps get implied permission because the Andorian commander basically said, yes, the ship is going to be launched at 0800 hours and there's not going to be anybody on it and it's going into the blue star and it's going to be destroyed. To tell that to kids who have already stolen the ship once, they really don't need to know that much information, that detailed, unless you're trying to set them up. It's kind of like we were talking about how the Doctor previously said, oh, I'm off to Shuttle Bay 3. I mean, Shuttle Bay 2, there is no Shuttle Bay 3. Why would you be so obvious unless you want the kids to know that? And I feel like the commander did the same thing.
Yeah, I think that's possible. And, we've already seen that the bridge staff really hated the idea that they were going to have to close this wormhole. They were all really invested in this rescue mission. And I think we may find, like, crazy theory, maybe at the end of the season, this entire season turns out to have been like an elaborate way for Janeway to flout the rules by just being like, oh, those darn kids, they stole the time ship right out from under my nose. Um,
How awkwardly convenient.
yeah, yeah. And because, of course, Daltate decides on the most dangerous possible way to steal the ship, right? Like, let's wait until they start flinging it into the sun, and then we'll cloak and fly away before anyone notices that it doesn't actually go into the sun.
I mean, there is a real risk there, but the end result is very similar to what we've seen in other Star Treks. Like there was at least one time, or twice actually, now that I'm thinking about it, where the Discovery did a spore jump at the exact moment that a photon torpedo hit. So it looked like they had been destroyed and there was nothing left. And I'm sure, I can't think of specific examples, but I'm sure there are other times, perhaps in TNG, where they went to warp at exactly the right moment. So that, oh, the ship is gone. We blew it up. So they're kind of doing the same thing. Like, hey, if the ship looks like it's destroyed, they're not going to come looking for us. And then we get freedom.
Yeah. And then, so they build their hollow selves. I love that we see them encounter their hollow doubles on on a holographic replica of the Protostar Bridge. And I just love how like Rock's little tossed off line, like, oh, I find it easier to think in here. I'm like, oh, but also I feel like that had to have been significant, right? Like they chose to animate it that way for a reason.
Yeah, it did strike me as, if nothing else, bittersweet because we've seen there was an early episode of TNG where Picard went back to Paris and he eventually like shut down the program. He's like, what am I doing here? This isn't real. It's just a false recreation of a memory I once had. Scotty did the same thing when he went to the Enterprise with no A, B, C, or D after it. And we see the kids here going back to a place where they came together as a crew, where they became friends and even family. The only thing missing is hologram Janeway.
Yeah. Well, and then real Janeway comes in.
Mm-hmm.
While they're and they already like it's already going wrong with the hollow doubles because the hollow doubles don't understand that they're hollow doubles. I'm like, oh great, like what could possibly go wrong? I thought it was very clever that the real kids hid themselves behind the furniture on the Protostar. Like that was a cute gag because you're waiting because you see the hiding and you're like waiting to see which one of them it is, and then you realize it's the real kids hiding themselves. Um, but I felt like the Protostar bridge was sort of a reminder that like, like actually these kids are actually perfectly capable of taking this ship and completing a mission on their own with no other adults. Like they actually know how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of putting them back into what you might even consider their natural habitat for a minute was a nice little reminder that like, yes, they're kids, but they're also like way more competent than anybody on the ship is giving them credit for.
Yeah. And it was also nice just to see the Protostar because that's also where we got to know these kids in the first season. And we've been talking about how it's still in the opening credits, which implies that maybe it's not really gone. Maybe we will be seeing more than just a hologram of it in the future.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Nice. I agree with you. I think we're going to have the Protostar back by the end of the season. Or a version of it.
Now, in this episode, Janeway, we have a moment where she's in her quarters and she's going along some mementos, some touchstones on her shelf. And that's where she gets the swirl of the stone from Chakotay. But one of the other things on there, it kind of looked like a compact, like a woman might have makeup in, for example. I don't know if that is what it actually was, but it made me go back and read the Memory Alpha article for Year of Hell, part 1 and 2 in Voyager. Is that what you were thinking of?
And I was the pocket watch. Was it a pocket watch he gave her?
That's exactly what it
That's
was.
what it made me think of as well.
A silver pocket watch because it was the right color. It looked maybe a little big, but he, I'm pretty sure that she gave it back to him in that episode and had him turn it back in for like replicator rations. So I don't think
Yeah, but
she
if you recall,
Hmm?
at the end of the year of hell,
It got reset.
they like closed the time and it got reset. And so that, because remember he
Right.
had said he'd had it replicated months ago.
You're right.
And so I assume that he had it already planning to give it to her for her birthday or whatever it was, and that he eventually did.
I think you're right. I had overlooked that detail. You're probably correct. I'm glad that we were both reminded of that because it means other people picked up on it, and that's what the designers intended.
We just rewatched Voyager with our son last year, so that was still reasonably fresh in my mind.
Wow, you watched all of Voyager in 1 year?
No, I mean, we would watch like a few episodes a night.
Wow.
He wasn't necessarily present for all of it, but like when we want like good like comfort TV, like we will absolutely put on like we'll pick like one of the 90s Trek shows and watch several hours of it. Yes, even DS9, even though it is much darker.
That's awesome. I will sometimes pull out like a specific episode. Like I might go rewatch TNG Cause and Effect or A Fistful of Datas, or I'll watch the Discovery season 1 episode that's like Groundhog Day because I love seeing Lorca killed over and over and over. But I generally don't do a lot of rewatches, as I've said on this podcast before. Like all of Deep Space Nine, all of Enterprise, all of Voyager, I watched them each when they aired, and that's it. And all my memories of those shows are 30 years old now.
Well, see, those shows were out like at least partially while I was in college. I just didn't have regular access to TV. So a lot of those I kind of like was only vaguely aware of when they were originally airing. So being able to go back and watch them in a more organized fashion has been really helpful in my overall Trek knowledge.
See, I went to college about 30 minutes from where I grew up, and I had a car.
Mm,
So I would often go back home and watch Star Trek with my dad.
that's nice.
It was a great tradition. I miss it.
That's a nice memory.
Yeah. So, also in this episode, we had a very important appearance at the near the very end of Maj'el.
Yes.
She played a critical role in this episode because in the previous episode, Observer's Paradox, we see her walk into the cafeteria and she's not really sure which table to sit down at, and she sits with her other Nova Squadron nerds. And then in this episode, she says to the Protostar crew that it's important to help your real friends. And I wonder what
Yes.
sort of a dig she was making against Nova Squadron there and what prompted that.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly her experience with them on the planet would have like trauma bonded them, right? Um, but also I thought so I noticed that when Zero and Hollow Zero were like chasing each other around through the halls of the ship, Zero had an encounter, one of the Zeros had an encounter with Maj'el, and we've already established, and they have reminded us that as a Vulcan, Maj'el's telepathic abilities are enhanced in the presence of another telepath. So I assumed that they didn't say, but I assumed that Maj'el picked up on something during all of those hijinks, right? That at some point, either she had run into the Zero who enhanced her telepathic abilities and she figured out what was going on, or she ran into the fake Zero and realized that she wasn't getting any effect like that and figured out that something was going on. And so that is why I think she was able to step in and help. But what I noted in here is the specific way that she says that and the way that she speaks to Zero. Did I detect just maybe a note of like more than friendship? Like Zero's a non-corporeal entity. Um, but I don't know. I felt like maybe there was like not a flirtation. Flirtation would have been inappropriate to the moment, but there was like it was like freighted with additional meaning there. And I was like, am I hearing this? Am I imagining it? I don't know. But I'm interested to see if that turns into anything or if it's just me making stuff up.
Well, in case you're looking for validation, I was watching this episode with a friend of mine who has been on this podcast before. And as soon as Maj'el said the line to Zero that you just shared, my friend pumped his fist into the air and said, "Lesbians!"
I mean, in fairness, I'm not sure that Zero has gender, but yes, I absolutely did think like, oh, are we getting like a cute queer couple on Prodigy? I would be so excited about that.
I think that would be very appropriate. We've seen it in shows like She-Ra and Steven Universe. I think having now seen it in the adult live action show Discovery, it would be nice for Star Trek to represent infinite diversity and infinite combinations in an animated show, which we saw in Lower Decks with Mariner, but also in a kids show, because letting kids see people who look and feel and act like them helps to validate their own existence and lets them know that they can grow up to be like that.
Yeah. So all of our little like non-corporeal, non-binary friends out there who are in a suit to prevent their true form from driving people mad, you too can have like it's just such an odd it's like Zero is such an odd choice to do that with, right? And I haven't decided how I stop because Siri just spoke to me. I will start over again. Zero is such an odd choice for that because Zero is non-corporeal and like lives in that sort of suit. And I mean, maybe in some ways that makes them the best choice, but it also kind of makes it a little bit of a weird choice in terms of sort of Star Trek's well-known penchant for social messaging.
Well, for what it's worth, I am also a non-corporeal being wearing a suit so that my true form does not drive people mad. It's just that my suit is made of flesh.
I'm really glad that we have representation for you, Ken.
I try. I think more people than realize fit that description and are watching this show.
Sure. And maybe I'm underestimating that group of folks. But either way, like I'm in favor of it. I just thought it was kind of an interesting choice to pair those two characters specifically, if that is indeed what they're doing. So, and it seems to me like that's what they're doing.
Love takes many forms.
The non-corporeal heart wants what the non-corporeal heart wants.
Can you have a non-corporeal heart?
Well, precisely my point.
Well played. So the last thing we see in this episode is the holograms rebooting, and they have the wrong personalities.
Yeah, they all have, or at least the wrong voices. It was very strange. But I'm like, oh, great, wonderful. No possible way that this doesn't turn into a thing in the next episode. So, like, that'll be some fun hijinks, if nothing else.
I assume we are going to see those holograms and that something is going to come of this. It is also possible that the show will focus entirely on the Infinity, moving for at least an episode or two. And we won't know the fallout of the holograms until after that perspective, that point of view of the Infinity is reunited with Voyager when they get back. And Janeway is like, well, do I have something to tell you about what's been going on around while you've been gone? We caught your holograms doing this. So we might not actually see it. We might only see the repercussions of it.
Yeah, that could be. It was funny because they kind of lampshaded the joke. When Rock was like, well, there was a slight glitch, but I'm sure it's nothing. And I'm like, oh no. It's obviously something. And then we cut to them like walking out of the holodeck with at least the wrong voices and possibly the entire wrong personalities. So, yeah, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm excited to see more.
Me too. Yeah, when Rock said it's probably nothing, when in Star Trek is something ever nothing?
right? Like the smallest of glitches, the tiniest of microns, and all of a sudden everything blows up. We're in a different timeline, we're in a different like dimension, we're in a mirror universe.
The space-time continuum is exceedingly fragile. Do not mess with it.
Right? Have we learned nothing from years of these shows?
We have learned nothing, which is why we're going to keep watching them until we eventually learn something. We have another 14 episodes coming up of Prodigy. We've only watched 6 of them so far. We're going to continue doing podcasts for every 2 episodes. We're hoping to get another one out in the next 4 or 5 days. And then you and I separately happen to have aligned our summer vacations. So we're going to be offline for about a week each, the same week. And then we'll be back online closer to the end of July, and we're going to continue plowing through this. And for those who are watching at a similar pace or just want to go back and listen to our commentary, I understand you already had one friend doing that.
I did. Shout out to my friend Tom, who has been listening to the show and texting me his reactions as we go. Thanks for listening.
That is fantastic. It's always a pleasure to hear from listeners, whether they're sending in feedback through the website at transporterlock.com or they're just texting us directly. It's great to know that other people are enjoying Prodigy and Transporter Lock. Hope you all continue to do so. Until next time,
go fast.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a review on iTunes and keep your hailing frequencies open by following us on Twitter at TransporterLock or subscribing to our podcast and email newsletter at transporterlock.com.